Hey everyone, I wanted to quickly go over the new and exciting news we got for Pokemon Unite, thanks to the Pokemon Company finally providing us with the information that the game is finally ready set to launch within the next couple of weeks. Alongside this information, they've also decided to provide us with the full Pokemon Unite roster that will be available on day 1's launch, or at the very least that you'll have to unlock via in-game progression, because they do make that very clear. Some Pokemon will be locked to based on the leveling process, so they're not necessarily tied to you having to spend any sort of in-game currency or actual real money, but you will have to play the game a little bit to be able to unlock some of these Pokemon. And they break down all of these Pokemon into different type of categories. You have your typical attacker types, which are Pokemon that have low endurance but excel at dealing high heavy damage to any sort of opponents. Then you also have your speedster Pokemon. These are Pokemon that are high mobility and offense that excel at making quick attacks and scoring points. Then you also have your all-rounder Pokemon. These are Pokemon that have balanced offense and endurance, and keep in mind endurance is kind of basically defense and hit points, and that are highly tenacious fighters. So basically Pokemon that are ready to dish out damage while still be very good at defense. They also have defense type focused Pokemon, which have high endurance and excel at protecting your allies and hindering your opponents. These are basically would be your typical tanks. And then the last category, and probably the most interesting one to me, these are supporter Pokemon, and Pokemon that provide you the support and inflict status conditions to opponents or create heavy healing. So they are actually bundling here 3 specific Pokemon that I'll go over in a little bit, but one of them is a healer, the other one is a debuffer, and the other one is kind of like AoE control area. So they're not necessarily tying all of them to just being specifically healer focused, even though they're called supporters, but they're actually just saying like, hey, any Pokemon that isn't focused on just heavy damage or heavy defense or a little bit of both, we're gonna go just throw them into the supporter role, which is an interesting theory. So first I want to go over the attacking focused Pokemons that we'll be able to have in the game, starting out with Pikachu, and you also have a little bit of a little description for each one of them. It tells you their difficulty, whether it is that they're actually difficult for starters or a little bit more intermediate or for experts only, what type of Pokemon they are, whether they're attackers, defenders, etc., and whether they're close range or range Pokemon, and Pikachu seems to be a range Pokemon. And you also have a very easy to learn 5-star rating system for each one of the types: offense, endurance, mobility, scoring, and support. And as you can see right away, Pikachu's offense is 4.5, so he's very much oriented for high damage attacks, low endurance, decent mobility, average scoring, and average support. Moving over to Green Ninja, you see that his offense is a little bit lower, but he has almost the same type of endurance, but much better mobility and scoring as well, but almost no support. This is a difficulty expert Pokemon that's also attacker and range, so they are definitely focusing on range Pokemon in the attacker types. You also have another attacker range intermediate difficulty Pokemon with Venusaur. This is an offense type 4.5 one, which is very high for Venusaur. I would have expected it to be more of an endurance type Pokemon, but it actually has low endurance and low mobility with a little bit of better scoring and almost no support as well. This is kind of ongoing with the attacker types as well. Moving over to Alolan Ninetales, it has high offense, 4 stars, low endurance, low mobility, decent support, and actually decent scoring as well. So out of all the attacker types, you definitely see this one being the better supporter, although it's not necessarily aimed for doing just that. Then we move over to Cramorant, and we see that it has 4 offense, 3 endurance, 3 mobility, 1.5 scoring, and 1 support. So it's an average Pokemon at best. But interestingly enough, it has decent endurance and mobility, but it will be a tough out for a lot of other players to be able to deal with. And lastly, in the attacker types, we see Cinderace, 4 offense, 3 mobility, 2.5 scoring, and everything else is low. So this is pretty much following that same model of like high attack, decent mobility, average scoring. When it comes to speedsters types, these are the ones that are focused a little bit more on speed, and we only have 3 of them, interestingly enough, starting with Talonflame, which has 2.5 offense, 1.5 endurance, 5 mobility, and 3.5 scoring and no support. So you can easily see that this is a high agile movement Pokemon, but not necessarily with a lot of high damage. So they'll basically rely on their skills and their moves to be able to make real impact on the battlefield. Absol, however, is not the same case. It has a 4 mobility and a 3.5 offense. So you can easily see this one doing a pretty decent amount of damage, while also being very mobile and very agile with decent scoring, almost extremely no endurance whatsoever. The last one of the speedsters types is Gengar. This is a 3.5 offense, 4 mobility, 2 endurance, 3 scoring, and half support. So don't rely on support, don't rely on your endurance. It will be pretty good at doing some decent damage and also moving like Absol, which is interestingly enough for a Gengar type. And I think right out of the gate, when you start looking at the Allrounders, which are only 4 of them in the game right now, you'll start to see that these are probably going to be the ones that not only are the most popular picks out of all the Pokemon, but also are probably going to be the ones that are like probably out of the gate a little bit more overpowered than most. Starting with Charizard, who has 3.5 offense, 3 endurance, 2.5 mobility, and 3 scoring. So this one has no weaknesses whatsoever, other than support, which again, you wouldn't necessarily expect that. Charizard is one of those Pokemon that I don't necessarily see having any sort of weaknesses, and it's probably going to be in just about every single match that you start playing. Lucario is another interesting one because it doesn't actually evolve like any other of the Pokemon. There's no Riolu here. It's just Lucario right out of the gate, which is interesting. So it has a 3 offense, 2.5 endurance, 3.5 mobility, and 3 scoring. So definitely just almost all around stats lower than Charizard, which for some reason, I guess it makes sense. I see this one, it's like, if you're going to pick Lucario, why not just choose Charizard instead? Manchop is a 4 offense, 2.5 endurance, 2.5 mobility, 2.5 scoring, all-rounders. So you wouldn't necessarily be too surprised with the fact that it has high offense, but every other stats it's about as average as you would typically expect. And for some reason it has a 1 support, which I don't necessarily would ever think of this one as being a support type. And the last all-rounder we have is Garchomp, a 3.5 high endurance and high offense Pokemon with decent mobility and decent scoring. So kind of like in that same tier of Charizard, where like this one is just gonna be a tough outing for just anyone to deal with, and expect this one to be picked quite a lot by a lot of people. The next tier that we have is Defenders, and we only have 3 Defender Pokemon in the game at the time of launch. Starting with Snorlax, who has 5 endurance, 1.5 offense, 2 mobility, 1.5 scoring, and 2.5 support. So high endurance means that it basically can take a lot of hits, but at the same time it can't basically do anything else. And I don't necessarily know how that's going to work, other than the fact that their moves are going to be the deciding factor for these Pokemon, which are no different than the Speedsters. The Speedsters rely very much on their abilities to be able to do high damage while still being agile, and endurance Pokemon are just basically have to be tanks no matter what. We know that Crustle is probably one of the favorite ones that we saw in the betas, and that's because of the interesting moveset that it has. It has 4 endurance, 3 support, 2 scoring, 1.5 offense, 1.5 mobility. So don't expect high damage out of this one, but the moves that it actually has are more aimed at kind of controlling the area from the enemies and not necessarily letting them get away once you're chasing them. So his moveset is a little bit interesting, and I can definitely see this one being mixed up rather well in some interesting setups. Lastly, we'll have Slowbro with 4 endurance, 4 support, which is extremely high, low scoring, low mobility, low offense as you would have typically expected. And I don't necessarily know much about this one, to be quite honest, but the fact of the matter is that high endurance and high support means that it needs to have abilities are going to give you a little bit of an edge when it comes to dealing with enemies, because either you're boosting your party or debuffing the others. The last category we have here are the full-on supporters, and the only real healing Pokemon that we have in the game is Eldegoss, which is a 4 supporter, 2.5 scoring, 2.5 mobility, 2 endurance, 1.5 offense. And it basically says like all their moves are based on healing, so you wouldn't necessarily expect this one to be anything but that. Mr. Mime is a 4 endurance, 4 support one as well, which is a really interesting one for sure. So he can take a lot of damage, but it says that he's basically focusing on hindering opponents' attacks and movesets. So he's basically very much like Disable type of Pokemon, that like he will stop other Pokemon from being able to do a lot of the things that they definitely want to be able to do. And the last supporter type is Wigglytuff with a 4.5 support, 2.5 endurance, 2.5 mobility. And this one is basically just like an AoE stopper. Like he will be able to just automatically stop you in your tracks. He has an ability where you are basically just, you can stop him from being chased, and then but Wigglytuff is also locked into that same position as well. So you're not necessarily like in a powerful place unless you have a lot of support around you to be able to deal with all the damage because Wigglytuff can't necessarily do a lot of damage. But that's all the Pokemon that are going to be available at day one at the time of launch. We should expect to see a lot more Pokemon to be introduced, as you typically would in a lot of MOBAs, and hopefully the supporter and defender types are able to get a lot more support and a lot of healer types and diverse healing types, because I don't see Eldegoss being the only one healer to sticking around in this game for very long. If you're brand new to my channel, be sure to leave a like and subscribe, hit the bell to receive notifications when the videos go up, and as always, thank you so much for watching. See ya!